In the smoky haze of a Harlem bar, behind Bumpy Johnson's back, his own bodyguard, Sam, pulled the trigger. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. The room froze. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. All that existed was that metallic click and the suffocating silence that followed. Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover. He turned slowly, deliberately, his eyes locking onto Sam's. There was no surprise in his face, only a cold, calculating assessment. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a declaration of war from the 5 families, delivered by the man sworn to protect him. The unspoken question hung in the air. What happens when you try to kill a king and fail? To understand this ultimate betrayal, you need to understand the chess game Bumpy Johnson had been playing for a decade. This was just the moment his opponent finally showed their hand. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson didn't inherit his kingdom. He built it on a single, unbreakable rule. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And you earned it through a combination of absolute control and ruthless intelligence. By the late 1950s, his control over Harlem was total. He was the undisputed master of the neighborhood's lifeblood, the numbers racket. This illegal lottery, the policy banks, was a multi-million-dollar operation that touched nearly every household. But Bumpy's genius was in the balance. He ran a criminal empire while serving as the community's protector. He kept the streets orderly. He loaned money to families in a pinch. He made sure the ruthless predation common in other mob territories didn't happen in Harlem. He was a gangster, but he was their gangster. This created a delicate, unspoken agreement with the Italian syndicate, the 5 families downtown. For years, there was a border. Harlem was Bumpy's territory. They operated elsewhere. He paid a tribute, a tax for the privilege of operating without interference. It was a business arrangement. But the foundation of that arrangement began to crack with the ambitions of men like Charles Lucky Luciano. The Commission, the ruling body of the mob, saw the untapped millions flowing through Harlem and started to see Bumpy not as a partner, but as a middle manager. A lieutenant in charge of a lucrative district that they ultimately owned. They failed to understand that Bumpy Johnson was no lieutenant. He was a king, and his strategic position was unique. He was both a partner who facilitated their business in his domain and the single greatest barrier to their total expansion. He was the gatekeeper, and they were about to try and kick the gate down. The Commission's view of Bumpy Johnson was their first and most critical miscalculation. From their plush chairs in social clubs in Little Italy, they saw a black man running a neighborhood operation. They saw a subordinate. Their plan was simple, arrogant, and doomed from the start. Apply enough pressure and Bumpy would either capitulate, becoming a compliant puppet, or he would be removed and replaced with someone more pliable. They started with economic pressure. They began hijacking his shipments of betting slips and cash. They sent their own enforcers to intimidate Bumpy's runners on the street, shaking them down, warning them a new regime was coming. Bumpy's response was a masterclass in strategic patience. He didn't retaliate with immediate, blind violence. That's what they expected. That's what any other gangster would have done. Instead, Bumpy reinforced his own networks. He doubled down on loyalty within his organization. He absorbed the financial losses, viewing them as the cost of doing business while he figured out his opponent's endgame. This patience was misinterpreted as weakness. The mob escalated. They moved from harassing his foot soldiers to targeting his financial infrastructure directly. They firebombed a policy bank that served as a major collection point. They believed Bumpy was folding. They thought the pressure was working. Their key mistake, the fatal flaw in their entire strategy, was believing Bumpy Johnson was a man who would fold. They didn't understand that his silence wasn't submission. It was the quiet of a predator calculating the perfect moment to strike. They were playing checkers, trying to take his pieces one by one. Bumpy was playing chess, and he was about to sacrifice a pawn to checkmate the king. The mob's pressure campaign wasn't working, so they shifted tactics. If they couldn't break Bumpy's organization from the outside, they would rot it from within. They needed a weak link. They found one in Sam. To the outside world, Sam was the perfect bodyguard. He was loyal, quiet, and intimidating. He'd been with Bumpy for years, a trusted enforcer who had proven his mettle in street fights and standoffs. But the mob's intelligence apparatus, their network of informants and spies, dug deeper. They looked past the tough exterior and found a hidden vulnerability. It might have been family, a brother in debt to a loan shark they controlled, a mother with medical bills that were piling up, or maybe it was a past mistake Sam had buried, a moment of indiscretion or cowardice that he thought no one knew about. The mob's leverage was always personal, always undeniable. They didn't make vague threats. They presented Sam with a simple, brutal ultimatum, delivered in a shadowy backroom by a man he'd never see again. Do this one thing, and your problem disappears. Refuse, and we destroy everything you care about. Sam's internal conflict must have been a special kind of hell. On one side was his loyalty to Bumpy, a man who had given him status, money, and a form of respect he'd never known. On the other was the cold, certain ruin of his family, or the exposure of a shameful secret. The mob wasn't asking for information. They weren't asking him to skim money. They were asking for the ultimate betrayal, a bullet in the back of the man he was sworn to protect. The decision wasn't made in a moment of passion. It was a slow, agonizing calculation of survival. He chose his blood over his boss. The plan was set. They would orchestrate a hit that looked random, a chaotic bar fight, a stray bullet. Sam would be the hero who tried to save his boss, the tragic witness. It was clean, deniable, and would leave Harlem leaderless and ripe for the taking. They had turned Bumpy Johnson's shadow into their weapon. The night it happened felt like any other. There was no ominous feeling, no sense of impending doom. That was the genius of the setup. Bumpy Johnson held court at his usual table in a crowded Harlem bar. The air was thick with smoke and the sound of jazz. Laughter rang out. Money changed hands. His inner circle was there, a collection of trusted lieutenants and associates, completely unaware that the man standing guard behind their boss was a coiled spring of betrayal. Sam stood in his usual position, a silent sentinel. But tonight, the weight of the gun on his hip felt different. It wasn't just a tool of the trade. It was the instrument of his damnation. He'd checked the chamber a dozen times that day. He knew the plan backwards and forwards. The moment had been rehearsed in his mind until it was a perfect, terrible movie. Across the street, in the shadows of a doorway, A mob lookout waited. His job was simple. Watch the flow of the bar. Wait for the perfect moment of distraction. A loud laugh, a dropped glass, a group entering, and give the signal. It was a coded gesture, subtle enough to be missed by anyone who wasn't looking for it. A hand raised to adjust a hat. A match struck to light a cigarette. The signal came. Inside the bar, Sam saw it through the window. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. There was no going back. He drew his weapon. The motion was smooth, practiced. He raised it, aiming at the back of Bumpy Johnson's head from a distance of less than 3 feet. Point-blank range. Impossible to miss. He took a breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. He pulled, and instead of the world-shattering roar of a .45, there was a dry, hollow, definitive click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. The gun was a useless piece of metal in his hand. The rehearsed movie in his mind shattered into a million pieces of pure, undiluted terror. The mechanical failure was so absolute, so final, it seemed to suck all the sound out of the room. The jazz solo trailed off. The laughter died. Every eye turned to the frozen tableau, the boss, the bodyguard, and the gun that had just refused to fire. That silence was heavier than any sound. It was a physical presence in the room, pressing down on everyone. For a full 3 seconds, nobody moved. They were all trapped in that moment, waiting for the world to explode. Sam's hand trembled, the useless gun still pointed. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He'd prepared for everything, except for this. Failure wasn't part of the script. Bumpy Johnson completed his turn. It wasn't a frantic spin. It was a slow, deliberate pivot, a king turning to face a challenger. His eyes moved from the gun in Sam's hand up to Sam's terrified face. There was no anger there, no fear. His expression was one of cold, almost clinical calculation. The surprise that should have been there was absent, replaced by a deep, knowing resolve. It was the look of a man who had just seen a hypothesis proven correct. And then he spoke. Legend says the words were calm, clear, and cut through the silence like a razor. "I've been counting on you." Those 5 words were more devastating than any bullet. They meant Bumpy knew. He hadn't just gotten lucky. He hadn't been saved by a faulty weapon. This was a trap, and Sam had walked right into it. The betrayal wasn't a surprise. It was part of the plan. In that instant, the power in the room didn't just shift, it inverted completely. Sam wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the exposed prey. Before Sam could process this, before he could even think to drop the gun or run, 2 of Bumpy's other men were on him. There was no struggle, no dramatic fight. They moved with an efficiency that spoke of prior instruction. One man smoothly took the pistol from Sam's limp hand. The other gripped his arm, not with brutality, but with firm, unbreakable control. Not a single other shot was fired. There were no shouts, no chaos. The entire disarmament was silent and precise. Bumpy's demonstration was complete. He hadn't just survived an assassination attempt, he had orchestrated its failure. By allowing it to happen, by letting Sam pull the trigger, he had done something far more powerful than just killing a traitor. He had revealed the conspiracy in the most public way possible, in front of his entire organization. The message to every person in that bar was crystal clear. Bumpy Johnson's intelligence network was absolute. He knew things you didn't think he could know. He saw threats before they even formed. He wasn't just a leader. He was a strategist who operated 3 moves ahead of everyone else. He had turned his own bodyguard's betrayal into the ultimate proof of his own invincibility. The man who tried to kill him was now living evidence of why you could never kill him. Sam was led not to a dark alley for a bullet to the head, but to a small, windowless office in the back of the bar. This wasn't going to be about revenge. For Bumpy, revenge was an emotional luxury. This was about intelligence. The real weapon wasn't a gun. It was information. Bumpy's method was psychological pressure, not physical torture. He understood that a broken man tells you what he thinks you want to hear. A terrified man tells you the truth. He sat across from Sam, who was now slumped in a chair, stripped of his weapon and his dignity. Bumpy didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply laid out the facts with a chilling calmness. He started with what he already knew: the name of the capo who made the approach, the approximate date, the location of the meeting. He presented these details not as accusations, but as simple statements of fact. This had an immediate, devastating effect on Sam. The last shred of hope that he could lie his way out of this evaporated. Bumpy's knowledge was too precise. He wasn't guessing. He was confirming. The confession came out in a choked flood. Sam revealed the entire plot. He named names, from the low-level lookout across the street to the high-ranking members of the Genovese family who had authorized the hit. He explained the leverage they held over him, a brother's gambling debt that had spiraled into a life-or-death situation. He detailed the plan, the signal, the intention to make it look like a random act of violence, the promise of a payout and protection for his family upon completion. It was a strategic goldmine. Bumpy now had direct first-hand evidence of the 5 families' declaration of war. This wasn't rumor or suspicion. It was a sworn confession. And then came the fate of Sam. Bumpy made a decision that would baffle the underworld. He didn't kill him. Execution was the expected outcome, the necessary price for such a betrayal. But Bumpy saw a more valuable use for Sam. Alive. Killing him would just make him a martyr for the mob's cause. Exiling him sent a more complex message. Bumpy gave him a small amount of cash and a simple, terrifying warning. Leave New York. Never come back. If I see you again, or if I hear you've spoken to anyone about this, the debt your brother owes will be the least of your family's problems. Sam's life was spared, but his old life was over. He became a ghost. As Sam was escorted out a back door into the night, Bumpy was left with the crucial insight. The mob's play wasn't one of strength. It was one of desperation. They had resorted to turning a bodyguard because their conventional tactics had failed. They were trying to win a war with a single, cheap shot because they were unwilling to pay the bloody price of a real fight. They had underestimated his intelligence network, his loyalty within Harlem, and his willingness to engage in a conflict they thought he was too smart to start. Bumpy now held all the cards. He knew who his enemies were. He knew their strategy. And he knew they were afraid. It was time to write his response not in words, but in action that would echo through the streets of Manhattan. Bumpy Johnson didn't wait. That was the genius of his countermove. While the 5 families were still waiting for a report from their lookout, assuming their plan had succeeded, Bumpy was already in motion. He understood that in the underworld, speed is a weapon. Shock is a strategy. He wouldn't send a message. He would write it in blood and action, in a language the Commission could not possibly misunderstand. His retaliation wouldn't be proportionate. It would be overwhelming. The goal wasn't just to hurt them back. It was to fundamentally reset the balance of power and prove, beyond any doubt, that he was not a subordinate to be disciplined, but a rival power to be reckoned with. The first strike was economic, a direct mirror of their own tactics, but executed with surgical precision. While the mob had hit his operations with indiscriminate violence, Bumpy targeted theirs with intelligence. His men, acting on the information extracted from Sam, hit 3 of the mob's policy banks in Harlem simultaneously. These weren't random robberies. They were reclamations. His enforcers didn't just take the cash. They dismantled the operations, seized the ledgers, and delivered a clear, unified statement to the terrified managers. Bumpy says Harlem is closed. Tell your bosses the rent is due. In a single night, he erased their financial foothold in his territory. It was a public demonstration that their infrastructure was porous and his intelligence was superior. But taking back his own streets wasn't enough. The message needed to be delivered directly to the decision-makers. The next phase was brazen, a move so audacious it bordered on suicidal. He targeted a high-level capo, a respected member of the Genovese family named Vincent the Accountant Falcone, known for his role in overseeing the mob's Harlem interests. Falcone wasn't grabbed in a dark alley. He was taken from his favorite restaurant in Midtown, in front of his own associates. Bumpy's men walked in, surrounded his table, and simply escorted him out. There was no fight. The display of calm authority was more terrifying than a shootout. Falcone was held for 24 hours. He wasn't beaten or tortured. He was given a message to memorize. The next day, he was released unharmed on the steps of the Genovese family's social club. Ashen-faced and trembling, he delivered Bumpy's terms verbatim to the stunned leadership inside. The message was short, brutal, and left no room for interpretation. Harlem is mine. The price of entry is war. You sent a boy to do a man's job. I'm sending you back your man. The next one comes back in a box. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Bumpy had calculated the ultimate risk. By forcing the Commission to choose between launching a bloody, costly street war in a neighborhood that would fiercely resist them, or swallowing their pride and accepting a new reality, he was betting everything on their pragmatism outweighing their pride. He had taken their assassination attempt and turned it into a referendum on his power. The shockwave that hit the Commission was absolute. For a few days they had believed Bumpy Johnson was dead, that Harlem was leaderless and ripe for a takeover. Instead, they got a coordinated, multi-pronged attack that demonstrated not only was he alive, but he was more powerful and better informed than they had ever imagined. The abduction of a sitting capo was an unprecedented act of aggression. It wasn't a territorial dispute anymore. It was a challenge to their very authority. For the first time, the old men sitting around the table in Little Italy were forced to see Bumpy Johnson not as that Harlem numbers guy, but as Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a strategic adversary who had just outmaneuvered them completely. The realization was a cold splash of water. Bumpy was not a subordinate to be controlled. He was a rival kingpin who controlled a densely populated, fiercely loyal territory with an iron fist. The cost-benefit analysis of an all-out war in Harlem began immediately, and the numbers were terrifying. Harlem wasn't like other neighborhoods. It was a fortress. Bumpy had the community support. His intelligence network was clearly superior. They had known about the hit on their own man before it happened. Fighting him would mean sending soldiers into a hostile urban jungle where every pair of eyes on the street was a potential informant for Bumpy. The financial cost would be staggering. The body count would be unacceptable. It would be a war of attrition they could not possibly win without devastating losses. The commission fractured along predictable lines. The hardliners, led by older, more traditional bosses, argued for immediate and total retaliation. To them, the principle was everything. Allowing a black gangster to humiliate them like this would make them look weak. It would embolden every other ethnic group in the city. They had to respond with overwhelming force to re-establish the natural order. The pragmatists, however, saw a different reality. They saw the body bags and the financial ruin a war would bring. They argued that Bumpy had already won this round. He had proven his strength. He wasn't asking to join their commission. He was demanding they acknowledge his sovereignty over his own domain. Was a principle worth bankrupting the family and getting dozens of made men killed? The critical factor that tipped the scales was the very thing Bumpy had cultivated for years: his untouchability. It wasn't just his muscle or his street smarts. It was the fact that he was embedded in Harlem. He was protected by a wall of silence and loyalty that the mob could not penetrate. Trying to kill him had already failed spectacularly. Trying to start a war with him would be a disaster. The pragmatists won the day. The decision was made not to escalate, but to seek a sit-down. It was a tacit, humiliating, but necessary admission of Bumpy's equal status. They were going to negotiate a peace treaty with a man they had tried to murder, because the alternative was a war they knew they would lose. The chess match was over. Bumpy had forced a checkmate without losing a single piece of his own. The sit-down was unprecedented. It wasn't held in a mob social club or a Harlem bar. They chose a neutral, anonymous office in Midtown, a place with no history, no allegiances. When Bumpy Johnson walked in, accompanied by only 2 men, he wasn't coming as a supplicant. He was coming as a victor to dictate terms. The mob leadership, several of the most powerful men in organized crime, sat opposite him. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with pride. These were men who were used to being obeyed without question. Today, they would have to negotiate. Bumpy's terms were simple, clear, and absolute. He demanded complete and total autonomy in Harlem. The 5 families would withdraw all their operations permanently. The border was no longer an unspoken agreement. It would be a recognized, inviolable line. There would be no more tribute payments. Harlem was his, wholly and entirely. In return, he would ensure the peace. He would prevent any other upstart groups from challenging their interests elsewhere. He was, in effect, demanding to be recognized as the de facto 6th family boss, with sovereignty over his own territory. The mob's concession was a bitter pill to swallow, but they had no choice. The alternative was a war they had already calculated they would lose. They agreed. The handshake that sealed the deal was more than a formality. It was a seismic shift in the underworld's power structure. It was an acknowledgement that power wasn't just about tradition and bloodlines. It was about force of will, strategic genius, and the unwavering support of a community. Bumpy had redrawn the map not by asking for permission, but by demonstrating a power they were forced to respect. He returned to Harlem that night not just as its protector, but as its officially recognized, undisputed king. His authority was now unassailable, forged in the fire of a betrayal he had seen coming from a mile away. The incident didn't just save Bumpy Johnson's life, it cemented his legend. In the underworld, where reputation is everything, he became known as strategically untouchable. The story spread like wildfire. The man who knew his own bodyguard would betray him, who let him pull the trigger on an empty gun, and then used that moment to outmaneuver the entire Italian syndicate. It was the ultimate display of coolness under pressure and tactical foresight. For the next decade, a fragile but real peace settled over Harlem. The agreement held. The 5 families kept their distance. Bumpy's empire flourished, and the community enjoyed a period of stability and prosperity that was rare for any neighborhood under mob influence. The lesson was seared into the consciousness of every power player in New York. Underestimating Bumpy Johnson was a fatal error. He wasn't a thug. He was a master strategist. He had turned a moment of extreme vulnerability into his greatest strength. The long-term impact was profound. Harlem remained uniquely independent, a sovereign kingdom within New York City, largely free from the direct control of the 5 families for years to come. This single event, the shot that wasn't fired, became the foundational pillar of Bumpy's mythos. It was the story they told in whispers, the proof that he operated on a different level. He hadn't just won a battle. He had established a precedent that would echo for a generation. But ultimate power carries an ultimate price. For Bumpy Johnson, the cost was eternal. Vigilance. The respect he had earned through that confrontation wasn't a one-time payment. It was a debt that had to be constantly enforced. The isolation of command became his permanent reality. Could he ever truly trust anyone again after his own shadow tried to kill him? His legacy is that of the man who stared down a bullet and won a kingdom. But the victory came with the heavy burden of knowing that from that day forward, he could never fully let his guard down. He was the protector, but who was left to protect the protector? This is how you handle a threat from a position of perceived weakness. You don't panic. You use your opponent's arrogance against them, turning their moment of triumph into your strategic masterpiece. If this story of cold-blooded strategic genius got you hyped, hit that like button real quick. Smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson stories. History forgot. Drop a comment and let me know. Could the 5 families have handled this differently? Or was a war with Bumpy a fight they were always destined to lose?